Alright, so looking into the neuromuscular junction now. Now I usually draw out everything on the whiteboard, and so I tried to do a similar thing using my surface, so hopefully you like it. Okay, so let's look into the left hand side. Here, this is a motor neuron in black, modern art. So this is a motor neuron. And if you look at this neuron, this part is the cell body or soma. The long part is the axon. And these endings, these are called axon terminals. They are also known as terminal boutons, and they go by many other terms. But in this lecture, I'll refer to them as axon terminals or terminal boutons. Okay, now what do we see here? We see that a motor neuron is in very close proximity to a muscle fiber. So the red rod-like structure is a muscle fiber, right? So we have a motor neuron in very close proximity to a muscle fiber. It's not touching the muscle fiber, there's a gap, right? And if I look at the junction between the motor neuron and the muscle fiber and I blow that up, we see this structure that I drew out, the big structure. Now the junction between the motor neuron and the muscle fiber is called neuromuscular junction. And I have blown this up to look at the neuromuscular junction. We will look at the anatomy of the neuromuscular junction first, and then we will talk how things actually work. How an electrical signal is transmitted across the space to the muscle fiber to resulting in contraction of the muscle fiber. We will look into all those, but first we will start with the anatomy. Okay, so this is the axon terminal. Within the axon terminal, we have specific vesicles, and these vesicles are called synaptic vesicles. The synaptic vesicles are filled with a neurotransmitter, and the neurotransmitter is called acetylcholine. Okay. This part of the axon terminal is also called presynaptic membrane. What is this called? This is called presynaptic membrane. Okay, what else do we have here? On the axon terminal or terminal bouton, there are specific channels, and these channels are called voltage-gated calcium channels. They are called what? Voltage-gated calcium channels. All right. So we have the axon terminal. We have synaptic vesicles filled with acetylcholine. We know what is the presynaptic membrane, and we also know that in the axon terminal we have voltage-gated calcium channels. Good. Voltage-gated means that you need to have an electrical current flowing for these gates to open. Okay, so they are regulated by changes in voltage, meaning you need an electrical stimulus or an electrical current to open these gates. Good. Now let's look into the muscle fiber in red. The membrane of the muscle fiber is called sarcolemma. So I'll just put here, this is sarcolemma. That's a membrane. And at the junction, at the neuromuscular junction, the sarcolemma is folded. Do you see multiple folds of the sarcolemma? The folded part of the sarcolemma is called motor end plate. What is that called? This is called motor end plate. That's a folded part of the sarcolemma. The sarcolemma continues and it invaginates. What are invaginations of the sarcolemma called? Yes, you're right. Oops. These are called T-tubules. T-tubules. And along the T-tubules, do you see the red dots? These are voltage sensitive. These are voltage sensitive calcium channels. These are voltage sensitive calcium channels. All right. What else do we see? We see these light blue colored structures, and the light blue structures, I should change color now. These structures, do you see these? These are sarcoplasmic reticulum. These are, sorry, this is, let me erase. These are sarcoplasmic reticulum. And on either side of the T-tubule, you have these sac-like structures, which are part of the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and these sac-like structures are called terminal cisternae. Those are the sacs. And associated with the sarcoplasmic reticulum, do you see these blue lines? These are calcium release channels. What are they called? These are, I'll just label this one. This is calcium release channel. Now the voltage sensitive calcium channels in red and the calcium release channels, they have specific names that we will learn later. But for now, just know that on the T-tubules there are voltage sensitive calcium channels, and on the sarcoplasmic reticulum we have calcium release channels. All right, what else do we see here? We also see on the motor end plate there are specific channels, and these channels are called ligand-gated. Just label here. These are called ligand-gated sodium channels. Ligand means something that has to bind. So in order for these channels to open, something has to bind to it. It's like a lock and key thing. So if you think of these channels as locks, there has to be a key that will bind to these locks to open it. So they work as these doors with locks that needs key to open the doors. So they are different from the voltage-gated calcium channels that we saw on the axon terminal. Remember, for the voltage-gated calcium channels, we required a voltage or a current to open those gates. There has to be a current or an action potential to open those gates. However, on the motor end plate, we see ligand-gated sodium channels, which means there has to be a ligand which will bind to these channels to open them. Okay? All right. And then the space in between I will use a different color. Okay, go. Can you close the door, please? Sure, thank you. And the space, do you see the space in between? This space is called synaptic cleft. This is called synaptic cleft. Okay. Two other things I want my students to know. First, remember, we will talk about two ions here, calcium. Calcium concentration is really high in the extracellular fluid, meaning outside the cell we have high concentration of calcium as compared to inside. When we are looking at free calcium level concentrations, we have more outside, less inside. Sodium is another one we will talk about. That is also high in the extracellular fluid as compared to inside. So same. So both sodium and calcium, they are in high concentrations outside the cell. Know this. Okay? All right. And then there is another channel that I need to talk about. Which color? Let's put it in black. And these channels are called, they are all across the sarcolemma, and these channels are called voltage-gated sodium channels. Okay, so we talked about voltage-gated calcium channels on the axon terminal. We have ligand-gated sodium channels on the motor end plate, and we have voltage-gated sodium channels on the sarcolemma. In reality, there are some voltage-gated sodium channels on the motor end plate as well, but for testing purpose, we will say that the voltage-gated sodium channels are on the sarcolemma. Good? Okay, so we are done with the anatomy. I want you to spend some time to review this material before we move on to our next video. All right?